It's exciting that they announced they're going to start the launch of the Robotaxi fleet in Austin in, about a month and a half. I was kind of disappointed to hear that it was only 20 cars. So they did say they're going to use Model Ys. Some early videos that they've posted about it since they've launched the pilot program for employees of Tesla show someone still in the driver's seat sitting there while the car drives.
Welcome to Telltales. I'm Mike Nicoletti. Every week, along with my co-hosts Jason Wallace and Hunt Lawrence, we bring you the cash flow memo. Get it at telltales.us. For the next 30 minutes, we're going to dive deep into energy, technology, and healthcare. So download the memo now and get started.
The following conversation is intended for informational purposes only. You should always do your own work to determine if an investment is suitable for you.
Let's start. I'm going to start out like it did last week. There's really no new news, Exhibit C, except that the discussions with Iran continue. So seeing Iran sanctions in the near term doesn't seem likely. And I didn't really understand the articles in the news, print news this morning, but apparently Russia is willing to extend the Easter truce, whatever that is, if Ukraine will give up Crimea or any future rights to Crimea, which Ukraine says no, but at least they're talking. So I think the chance of any Russian sanctions is reduced in the near term, which leads to too much oil supplies compared to demand. On the other hand, the price of WTI has been trading a little higher in the low 60s rather than 60 flat. So I don't know what to make of that. I think one explanation is that Saudi Arabia, which is in the control seat in terms of allocating or having OPEC plus members to manage their supply, is probably going to keep some discipline in the market to keep Iran happy, because unlike the Obama administration, where Saudi Arabia was horrified that the U.S. was making a deal with Iran, now they're absolutely an advocate for the deal. For example, one of the news pieces I saw in the past week or so had the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia taking his brother, who's the defense minister, going to Tehran and hand delivering a letter to the Ayatollah. So clearly Saudi Arabia is trying to godfather this negotiation between the U.S. and Iran. And towards that end, the Iranians are really starved for cash. They don't have enough money to invest in their electric grid. They have rolling blackouts. Their currency has been doing poorly. They really need oil revenues. So in an odd kind of way, rather than have Saudi Arabia get very concerned about cheating and going for market share and having oil run down to $50 or something, where we may be is we may just kind of cruise along at WTI and the low 60s. Generally, Brent trades for a couple of dollars more than WTI. That may be what we're going to see in coming months, which isn't the end of the world, but it is, by the way, a full $8 or $10 down from last year. So we'll start to see that impact in the income statements for the oil companies. Page 2, spring has come. It's really interesting. If you look at the futures for how much the 26 price continues to come down. It was 450 and now it's 410. And I think when we do it next week, it'll be 380. And so it's not just the current price, which is impacted by, the shoulder months, the months between winter demand and summer demand for air conditioning. It's actually the 26 price is coming down. Still a very much better price than 24, which averaged 240. So we have here an estimate for 25 of 380. It's probably maybe a little on the high side, but even though there's too much supply, you see that supply of 106, we're doing 106 in April. So that's just a fact of life. The industry is very, very efficient and fewer rigs, but we'll still produce more gas. One of the interesting things here is that power demand, which has been better than LNG, increasing LNG demand, has been going up since 21, 1.5 Bs a day per year. In 25, it's pretty much flat with 24. So Everyone says data center demand, data center demand, data center demand, and gas is the answer, but it is flat. Fortunately, LNG, which had a flat year, 24 versus 23, is now easily going to be 16 Bs a day this year. So LNG has made up for it, but still that 106 is kind of troublesome. I think we could just pass over Exhibit A. Doge now says it's only going to find 150 billion of waste and inefficiency. That's not going to close the gap. The idea is that the deficit shouldn't be more than 3% of GNP. GNP is around 30, 3% is about $1 trillion. Instead, it's $2 trillion. How in the world are you going to reduce spending by $1 trillion? Waste and inefficiency is 150 billion. The Medicare and Medicaid programs other than waste and inefficiency are off limits. Pretty hard to do. I think once the Trump administration gets a resolution, budget reconciliation, through the House and the Senate and signed into law, they'll start to work on the next fiscal year's budget. It'll be really interesting to see what they come up with. I mean, it's a $6 trillion of spending away from $1 trillion of interest. In order to make real progress, you'd have to get at least 500 billion of spending cuts. That will be extremely difficult to do. Anything else, Mike or Jason?
I guess I wonder if the Doge effort is really, a couple months in and done. They have a 2-year window that they said they were going to operate. So, and we know the government's own estimates of fraud and waste in Medicare and Medicaid is 200 billion. So they didn't attack that. I wonder if that's something that, in the future they might address.
I'd also say on the Tesla earnings call, Musk made a point that he's taking, putting less effort into the Doge initiatives, though caveats it with his role is more about making sure that new fraud, waste, and abuse doesn't prop back up during the president's term. So it's kind of all aligns to that. Maybe they didn't find as much as they were hoping to find. And it's going to, balancing the budget's going to be harder than maybe they had hoped.
Right. Tesla reported after the close yesterday, I guess we've been kind of avoiding Tesla on page one. We might as well swing into Tesla. I talked with Mike about it this morning. So why don't we lead off with Jason? What's your overall impression of the Tesla results?
Better than feared, I guess. Some people were expecting gross margins to really fall off a cliff, and they held up. I believe off the top of my head, I think they achieved 14% without the energy subsidies, the credits. It's exciting that they announced they're going to start the launch of the Robotaxi fleet in Austin in, about a month and a half. I was kind of disappointed to hear that it was only 20 cars. So they did say they're going to use Model Ys. Some early videos that they've posted about it since they've launched the pilot program for employees of Tesla show someone still in the driver's seat sitting there while the car drives. So I wonder what, if that's going to be what the program's like going forward, and maybe that's why there's only 20 models on the road, since 20 employees would have to sit in the driver's seat and ride around all day. Yeah, it's you kind of hoped and expected it would be a completely autonomous car like a Waymo. Waymo's solution to get around the requirement that a driver's still in the loop is they have a remote driver. So if the car encounters issues, someone kind of logs in remotely and maneuvers the car out of it. I guess that's kind of what I was expecting in Teslas, but maybe that's not the case. One thing I didn't notice, I don't know if you noticed, Mike, is how their energy storage part of the business held up.
Probably the biggest concern on energy storage is the fact that they get all their batteries from China. Those are the LFP batteries. Tesla switched to LFP for the energy storage batteries in 2020, if I remember right. And that was a good move, mainly because the LFP batteries are much better from they're better from a economical perspective. Their power density isn't as high, but it's not as necessary for a grid, a power application on land. They're also less volatile and have had a very good track record when it comes to reliability and safety. So So that business, I think, is humming along pretty well. But the question about tariffs hangs over Tesla, and it hangs over everyone else.
What holds the stock price up? If they're only doing 20 vehicles in Austin, that sounds like a pretty modest program.
Yeah, I think it's the promise that it's going to scale quickly. And they made that point. I think, we've heard estimates, backing into what's the right number of robotaxis to service the country. And we've heard estimates on the low side, 600,000. And Musk and Tesla seem to think they can do 1 million a year or something like that. So you don't really know yet. And I think in order to get to the Tesla view that it could be a very large number, then the cost to the end consumer per mile has to be really low, because it's going to it would have to make it very obvious for everyone to just use a robotaxi rather than own a car. And if they get the price lower enough, maybe they can do that. But a lot of that is on the come. So the valuation is still pretty high. The other piece that is really driving the valuation, and probably maybe more so than the robotaxi stuff, is their humanoid robot program. They did say the humanoid robots are doing useful work in factories. And similar to full self-driving, the first versions of full self-driving were not great, and they got better over time. And I think we should expect to see the humanoid robot program get significantly better over time and at an increasing rate. But again, that's on the come. Musk repeatedly forecasts that he'd like to see them selling 1 million units of those humanoid robots by 2029 or 2030. So there's a lot banking on the future. And as you all know, we like to buy stuff at a fair price today and kind of get that stuff for free or cheap as the additional part of the valuation. So it would make entering a new position at Tesla here very difficult given what we know today.
Yep.
That said, it's a very exciting company. We're not selling our position in it, and we will have to see what happens over the next 12 months or so. And I think this Robotaxi rollout will be pretty telling. I mean, they're obviously being careful by only rolling out 20 vehicles to start. But assuming that goes well, you could see it expanding very quickly.
A couple of questions which we may not have the answers to, but you have to wait till next Wednesday. But how many drivers does Uber and Lyft have? Is it in the hundreds of thousands or rough magnitude? Or
I believe it is, but most of the drivers are, these aren't full-time drivers. They're picking up shifts, if you will, on either rush hour, or some of the drivers are exclusively driving on weekends.
Here's another question which we may have to continue next Wednesday. How many Waymos are on the road? I think they're in 4 locations. I think they're San Francisco, Phoenix, Austin, and Atlanta. And the impression I have is that there are a few hundred of them, at least.
I think they rolled out one of the cities with more than 1,000.
Uh-huh.
But like you said, we'll have to double check that. But it's something I remember hearing, because they initially did these small rollouts as well, and then they tried to really ramped up their number of rides in San Francisco. They've overtaken Lyft as the number 2. I don't know. I guess you don't call them rideshare, but the number 2 non-taxi taxi program.
Right. So with 1,000, they can operate like a much larger number of drivers, because I think most of the ride sharing companies report weekly active drivers or something like that. And that doesn't give you much of an indication, because maybe somebody turns it on Fridays when they don't, when they don't work, or, in the evenings or something like that. So yeah, it's a perplexing problem. If between the two, there's maybe 400,000 to 500,000 weekly active drivers. Again, I think in order to see a step change in usage, you have to have a significant reduction in cost.
Right.
But it's coming. Yeah.
Yeah.
Elon didn't hesitate to point out how expensive a Waymo vehicle costs on his call. And I think what was interesting is a lot of there's been a lot of discussion lately about insider reports of Tesla killing their cheaper Model 2. And I think what Elon was facing was a classic innovator's dilemma, and he's looking at it as that market. If they really can provide a robotaxi, is there a market for a cheap EV? Or will those people that are, bargain shopping for a car, if you will, are they going to just use a service on demand if it's the same cost? So, and then looking out in the future is what does car ownership look like in the future? And I think he's looking at it at a point is if he doesn't do robotaxis and go all in on robotaxis, someone else will, and they're going to capture the transportation market, and they're going to be left selling the cars that are used exclusively for, kind of enjoyment, like people ride horses today.
Yep.
I know I'm repeating myself from last week, but if you turn to page 20, Uber is surprisingly healthy. I mean, there's no debt, $6 billion of free cash flow, really impressive trading for, $130 billion, where Tesla on page 1 is trading for, $700 million. Now you do have the ability to make 2 million cars in China and US and Germany. And that certainly is worth something, but we've talked in the past of what their free cash flow should be from 2 million cars. But the number I kind of think of is maybe 8 or 10 billion of free cash flow, some magnitude like that. And, if that's worth, 8 times free cash flow or, whatever the right number would be for a car company, showing of, the moving into robots or doing full self-driving, that's about what Uber's trading for. And Uber has a network impact. I know we've done our Wednesdays, but Waymo has made a deal with Uber and Lyft, or one or the other. There's some kind of collaboration there that Waymo is
Right.
planning.
Yeah, with Uber, yeah. And they are looking at cheaper models. I've heard, I don't know if it's just rumor at this point, but they've been looking at a Chinese brand called Zeekr.
Right. Yeah. But it's basically the radar equipment that makes isn't it the radar equipment versus the Tesla cameras that adds like $10 or $15 or $20,000 per car, or is that an over?
No, I think it's even higher than that, because there's multiple laser range finding units on each car. So they're kind of positioned at all corners.
That was an interesting anecdote from the earnings call, is they had a question about glare on cameras for the Teslas. And the question was basically like, because there's a possibility of having glare on the camera, will the LiDAR always be better? And Elon gave a pretty technical explanation of how they believe they've solved it. And not to go too far in the weeds, but a typical camera will first send the data to a digital signal processor, which turns it into something that a human can look at. What they've done is bypass that and develop something called a photon counter. So obviously the data that comes out of that isn't readable, but it's something that they can use to train the models how to react to the scene. So I thought that was really interesting.
Okay, let's take a quick break for a message from Oakcliff Sailing.
Hi, Dawn Riley here again for your weekly update. It is sunny out in Oyster Bay. We just had to interrupt our workout so that we could roll a FAR 40 mast down to the OBMC. And up in Newport, where I was yesterday, we have the Temptation, the JB66 going in the water. We also have Wizard that's going to come down for the movie. We've got Ronnie up here. How you doing, Ronnie? Hey! He's getting some of the power boats in. And then we have, as I said, the movie coming in the beginning of May. We're supporting Sail GP, so we've got all the ribs being tuned up, which you saw last week. We have the Water Lovers Mixer this Friday at Oyster Bay. Everybody's invited to come and and party with us and eat hot dogs and mix and mingle and find their next crew member. And then finally, we have the Annapolis collaboration tour. So I'll be popping down to Annapolis on Saturday and be there Sunday as well. Please come visit. The presentation that we put together, which is collective knowledge of everybody in the country, is amazing. And I will see you then. Maybe I'll sleep at some point, but for right now, I got to go into the gym and get some workout. Oh my goodness. Everybody else is already on the run. I'm late. Bye. I found them!
And now back to the show.
Before we do Netflix, let's just do healthcare news because we're down the last 8 or 9 minutes or so.
All right. The FDA did announce they're going to start phasing out some petroleum-based food dyes from the food supply through 2026. And I was asked this past week why I keep focusing on that. And as an engineer, there's a saying in at least in software systems that garbage in gives you garbage out. Probably applies to our bodies as well. If we put garbage in our bodies, it's affecting our health. And I think long term, we look at cost savings in the healthcare system in the U.S. is if we make our population healthier, we need less healthcare services. We're going to spend less on it. So that's why it's important to me. There's an executive order. I think it came out as we were recording our last call. A lot of good info in that. A lot of good orders. One thing that they're going to close a loophole that is called the pill penalty. Basically, the IRA allowed CMS to negotiate prices. They set a different timeline of when a small molecule is able to be negotiated on price versus a biologic. So the White House is saying they want to put those on parity. Pharma companies have largely celebrated that. They wanted this pill penalty loophole kind of thing closed. I don't think they'll necessarily get what they expect. Small molecules can be negotiated after 7 years, biologics at 11. I think it's probably more likely that they both go to 7 years and they both get the shorter timeline than small molecules going to the longer timeline.
Right.
Some lesser covered points in that executive order, it called for innovation in the accounting systems that are used for Medicaid. I think that is maybe a potential where we're going to identify and eliminate fraud. All the states probably use different accounting systems, and then the data is not easily analyzed at a national level. Another thing in there is ensuring that low-income patients have cheap access to insulin and EpiPens. I don't know why that's not solved by now. We've been talking about it for years. Calls for reevaluating the middlemen in the pharma supply chain, not explicitly naming PBMs, but they do in another portion of the executive order where they want to have price transparency at PBMs. And the reason that's important is the PBMs set the formulary and then require the pharma companies to provide kickbacks on pricing and rebate system so that you don't really know where the money's going in the system. It's not transparent, and they're held to non-disclosure agreements where they can't talk about the pricing. Then one last thing about PBMs, my favorite type of business. Arkansas actually passed a law where they're outlawing a PBM from owning a pharmacy. So that absolutely hugely affects CVS, but all the other PBMs do own either a specialty pharmacy or a smaller chain of pharmacies nationally. So it started in Arkansas. New York and Texas both have similar legislation that they're discussing, and if it catches on, maybe at the national level is a remedy to try to impact what's going on with PBMs and how they are adding costs to the system and shifting profits into the insurance companies where they're largely supposed to be capped on how much profit they take out of the system. Other news, Marty McCary was giving a couple interviews, and in those he discussed more on the rumor that Mike was speaking about, that phase 3 clinical trials might be phased out. We've had debate here about that, and I think he gave more color on it, and it's kind of a good compromise where maybe phase 3s don't need to be required for rare disease treatments. So allow people to opt in at an earlier stage in the development life cycle and then do post-marketing studies on that.
Yeah. This is all on page 19. I updated these 10Ks last weekend, and United Health Group, which Jason finds, particularly troublesome, has $28 billion of free cash flow. And the stock price, of course, has come down quite a lot and probably should come down given their vulnerabilities. Jason, there was some Lilly news. They're making some progress on the weight-losing medicine that you don't have to get a shot for. You just do a pill.
Yeah, Lilly and Novo have been working on this, and I think they both have submitted for FDA approval on their competing drugs, and it's a daily pill form of these GLP-1 drugs. So, potentially if there's probably a section of the population that doesn't want to inject themselves weekly. And then potentially, I think for me, not me personally, but from my point of view is you can control your own personal dosing better if it's a pill form and shelf stable. And you can maybe, instead of daily taking a pill, you can every other day, every third day or something. I do think where this ends up is a class of drug kind of similar to metformin, and it's, low doses of it could be, beneficial to most people.
In pulling apart Regeneron, it's gone down quite a lot. I mean, it's down to about 12 times free cash flow, but, it's a pretty solid performer. Maybe not as attractive as Vertex Pharmaceutical, and I know it has a wider array of products, but I guess that has to do with patent cliffs or other issues they face, Jason, or?
They have patent cliff issues. The company has great management. And they've also had additional competition in their Eylea against their Eylea drug. So, and then they have a new version that they've been trying to get approved for different segments of the market with mixed results. So, yeah, threats to the revenue there.
Yeah. Netflix did very well. Netflix announced the last time they reported earnings, they weren't going to report subscribers, probably a smart move. And they were just going to focus on revenue and cash flow. Here we're all the way back to page 4. Now, a lot of companies have come down, the companies on page 1 and companies in general. That's not Netflix. I think when we were reviewing tariffs, we said that might be one of the companies that, other than recession risks and people's deciding that one of the ways they want to economize is reduce their subscriptions, and Netflix seemed well situated. Marty and I have been talking mornings about content and sports. And of course, Netflix did NFL games on Christmas Day, and they do WrestleMania, but they really kind of stayed away from sports. But I think that's a worthwhile thing to spend more time on next week. Sports seems like the most attractive content that out there. Netflix is sitting here with $10 billion of free cash flow or $9 billion of free cash flow, and they must have like 50 or 60% of all the revenues generated from streaming. But they're very measured on sports. Jason, what would you predict? In other words, what does Netflix look like in 2 or 3 years, do you think, vis-a-vis sports?
Well, I don't know if it'll play out, but what I would maybe like to see is all of the leagues have their own streaming packages, and even some of the teams have their own individual streaming packages where you can play all the Yankees games, for instance. If Netflix offered that and you could add on, subscribe to those through a single service, I think there's a lot of value there where you're not spread among all these custom services that the league has to maintain their own, and even to the sports team level. So I do think, and like you said, there's a lot of value in live sports. It's maybe that and news are maybe the two portions of media that can't be replaced by technology in the future.
Right, and interestingly, news and sports are the kind of the last ones to be transition to streaming. So I think Netflix strategy has been to do as little as possible, because many of the sports teams have enjoyed extremely good deals with the cable companies, because it's been the content that they can't live without, even though many of their customers maybe don't really care to have access to it. So everybody subsidized sports for the diehard fans. So how do you transition that into a world where you can charge exactly for what you consume? And how do you, if you're Netflix, you can afford it, but you only want to make that investment if you're going to get a return on it. So I think that with them introducing advertising, I think that could be a path for monetizing the sports leagues better. If they do a revenue share rather than pay whole hog for owning the content, that could be an opportunity. But I think to get there, one, they need to have a more mature advertising business, and two, the leagues need to be more desperate for a deal. And right now, they're not really that desperate for a deal.
Yeah, I think a good package that they could offer in the future is getting the rights to an Olympics or a World Cup type of event. There's a lot of content packed into a very short duration, and no one can watch it all in real time, which is usually how it's aired. Or well, in the case of Olympics, it's aired as a primetime segment. They could offer streaming of whichever or all the events, and you can watch it at your leisure.
Yeah, the app that NBC or Peacock or whoever did it last time, it was hard to use. And frankly, one of the cool things that Netflix has is a recommendation algorithm that services what you want to see. So, Netflix would look at my viewing history, realize that I've watched some sailing movies, and probably push some of the sailing up to the top, which is practically impossible to find otherwise. So yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting idea, Jason.
Yeah. At least half our podcast next week, unless something comes up, we'll talk more about streaming and media in general. In the meantime, everyone be well and stay healthy, and we'll be here exactly 7 days from now. Take care.
The views expressed on this podcast are the hosts alone and do not constitute an offer to sell or a recommendation to purchase or a solicitation of an offer to buy any security nor a recommendation for any investment product or service. While certain information contained herein has been obtained from sources believed to be reliable, neither the hosts nor any of their employers or their affiliates have independently verified this information, and its accuracy and completeness cannot be guaranteed. Accordingly, no representation or warranty, expressed or implied, is made as to, and no reliance should be placed on, the fairness, accuracy, timeliness, or completeness of this information. The hosts and all employers and their affiliated persons assume no liability for this information and no obligation to update the information or analysis contained herein in the future, and may or may not hold positions in the securities mentioned.